Howdy, folks. I'm here to finally put up the video regarding the Hand of Thrawn duology and some of my parting thoughts. I apologize for taking so long to get this out. I had intended to take a couple of days to have a little bit of a break and compose my thoughts to do this video. And as tends to happen, life just kind of got a little busy, and I've had trouble setting aside the time to try and do this video. Um, I haven't really put any thoughts together on paper or anything to think about what I wanted to say. I'm going to be going primarily off the cuff here. But there's a few things that I wanted to address about this series. One of the things that I heard from a lot of people was that they missed the fact that I didn't really do commentary at the end of the chapters on these books, and that was actually deliberate on my part. Uh, there were really two main reasons for that. The first is that this is a Zahn series that is not one of my favorites. I'm actually not a huge fan of the Hand of Thrawn duology, and I was actually a little bit surprised that this was the series that people wanted me to read. I'll get into the reasons for that as we discuss the book series. The other reason is that I had only read this series one time before when it first came out, and I believe the first novel came out in '96. So I was about 28 years removed from it. I remembered many of the major events, but not the fine details, and so it's a little difficult to speak in an authoritative way when I'm not 100% sure that I'm remembering everything correctly. So I wanted to make sure we got to the end of the series before I talked about where we ended up in this particular story. So, before we dive into the story details, I think it's kind of important to recognize where Lucasfilm and Lucas Books were at this stage of the old EU. At this point, they'd been publishing novels under the Bantam line for, I guess it would have been about 5, 6 years, somewhere in that neighborhood. And there had been several stories that had been written by several different authors. Zahn, of course, ushered in this era of the EU. And it was like a thunderbolt that came out of the sky and lit a fire. Really made quite a sensation, and I believe that's really what kicked off the revival of Star Wars to begin with. But they had had so many authors come in with so many different ideas that quality was a little bit inconsistent. You had some authors that would collaborate with each other, others that didn't. A lot of times you would have some contradictory details that would later have to be papered over, and the quality of the novels would vary greatly. There are some that I think are really, really good. There are some that are almost inexplicable in the Star Wars universe. And the bargain that I made back in those days was the idea that Lucasfilm was doing something different with their publishing program than anything I think I had ever seen before in any other franchise. And that was that the stories in their publishing program mattered. Now, there were eventually they settled on this concept of having multiple levels of canon. You had the G canon, which was George canon, which was absolute bedrock. You had I don't remember what the various levels were called. I think I want to say C Canon. I think was the publishing program, and then you had there was games were at a different level. I don't remember the labels, but they had basically different levels of concreteness to them. But everything was supposed to be beneath the G level canon. Um, but still, that bargain was that these stories mattered, and if something happened in one novel series, it would affect what happened in the next. You were supposed to avoid doing anything that would contradict something that somebody else had already done. Now, they weren't always successful at that. Sometimes there were little things that would slip through, and sometimes George would change something himself that would require yet more retcons that were coming. But one pattern that established itself after not too long of a period was the recurring theme of villains of the week and especially super weapons. Now, in the original trilogy, you had the Death Star 1 and you had the Death Star 2. A lot of people now mock Star Killer Base in the sequel trilogy, and a lot of that is because we had a couple other Death Stars in the EU. There was actually the prototype Death Star that was in the Maw cluster from the Kevin J. Anderson Jedi Academy trilogy. You had the Dark Saber, which was again Kevin J. Anderson, which was the Hutts trying to make their own version of the Death Star. Also in the Kevin J. Allen Jedi Academy trilogy, you had the Sun Crusher. Um, and so super weapons quickly played out. It was becoming just this trope that was becoming more and more ridiculous, particularly the farther on from the Battle of Endor that you got. Um, and so Bantam sales were weakening. There was more criticism that was coming along, and a decision was made that they were going to be moving to a different publisher. And they brought in Zahn to do the Hand of Duology to kind of wrap up the Bantam line before the handoff went to Del Rey. And the idea was that moving to Del Rey, they would have much longer story arcs, oftentimes with multiple authors, but that was meticulously planned beforehand. Sometimes more meticulously than others, as different story arcs would kind of show. Um, but Zahn had been the guy that brought this era of Star Wars in, and they kind of wanted him to be the one that wrapped it up. Now, this kind of gets into some of the reasons why I'm not a huge fan of the Hand of Thrawn duology. Um, to start with, I was a little nervous about reading this story at this time because it involves this attack that had happened in the past on Kamas, an innocent planet that had at least been partially orchestrated by Bothans colluding with Emperor Palpatine sometime in the Republic period before the Empire, and it leads to this galactic crisis where the Republic begins to fracture, which, from a storytelling perspective, actually makes a lot of sense. They've gone from being a rebellion to actually being a cohesive government to now dealing with actually governing, which is much different than trying to overthrow a government. Now that they've had some peacetime under their belt, they begin to get a little bit complacent. They begin to not necessarily remember how bad things were under the Empire, and they start jockeying for position themselves. Um, this is a better way of telling the story than I think what they've tried to do in the Disney canon with The Mandalorian and others showing the New Republic as almost criminally corrupt. Um, but we're living in kind of an interesting time ourselves, and I was a little squeamish about addressing that here, especially also given what's happened with the attacks on Israel in October and what's going on in the Gaza Strip now. Some of this stuff feels like it hits maybe a little bit too close for home, at least for me sometimes. Um, Not that that's the fault of the story. The story was told when it was told. Um, and I think that they came up with a good resolution for how they brought the New Republic back together by the end of this story. But another thing that happened in this story was it felt to me like Zahn getting a little bit ham handed with the storytelling, in that there had been many different authors that had told many different stories of varying quality under Bantam. Um, and a lot of what happens in this story feels to be like Zahn going, no, not like that, like this. And when you can detect the author's voice sort of correcting some of his fellows, um, I do agree that some of that needed to be done, but I also felt that it was a little bit too transparent and it pulled me out of the story a little bit. Another element of the story is that because Grand Admiral Thrawn had become such an outsized figure in the EU, he was right up there with Darth Vader and Emperor Palpatine. Um, there was a strong desire to bring Thrawn back in some capacity. And I sort of feel like Thrawn, or like Zahn rather, wisely understood that it would not be a good idea to bring the real Thrawn back. But he wanted to have a Thrawn like story. And so he conceived of the idea of this triumvirate between Moff Disra and Major Tierce and Flim the con artist. And to me, this felt a little bit more like a Saturday morning cartoon plot rather than something a little more serious that he had done in his earlier novels. Besides that, it feels a bit like a cheat. You set up the idea that, well, maybe Thrawn's really going to return in 10 years. He said that he would, according to um, um Park. And they kind of begin to tease that a little bit, especially when you get uh, under the caverns and you find the cloning facility and you see Thrawn's clone there in the tank. Um, but of course, he didn't follow through with it, and I think it's wise that he didn't. But I also feel like you're trying to cheat a little bit. You know what the audience wants. This is what they came here to see. You dangle it in front of them, and then you take it away. Um, and again, I think it's the right decision, but I also think maybe Thrawn didn't really need to be in this. Maybe it would have been better if we had had some other threat. I do think by this time in the storytelling, it was a wise thing to wind down the battle with the Empire to sign an armistice and finally have peace. In the timeline, we're now 10 years beyond the Battle of Endor. It did make sense that the Empire wouldn't fall even after the Emperor is destroyed on the second Death Star. It makes sense that the Empire would continue fighting on. But by this point, they would be fighting a rearguard action and just trying to hold on to what they have. And I feel like that's the thing that Zahn gets in many ways better than almost any other author is the politics of Star Wars. He understands politically how the Republic would function. He also understands militarily how a campaign would be fought. And I think that's why so many people gravitate towards him, as well as the interesting characters that he creates. And that's again where I think Disney has completely fallen down when they try and show how the Republic functions in their version. They've infected everything with moral relativism and show that everybody is corrupt or incompetent, and it leaves you no one to root for. At its heart, Star Wars is an idealistic story. It's something that should leave you hopeful, and I think that's something that Disney has completely failed to do. The final aspect of this series, which is again an area where I feel like Zahn gets a little ham-fisted with, is putting Luke and Mara together. This was something that he always wanted and always intended from the very beginning of the Thrawn trilogy, and I can see where he was setting up that relationship. Obviously, they start off with Mara wanting to kill Luke, not even fully understanding why. She's a strong, capable woman uh, who's a force in her own right. And the fact that Luke gave her his father's lightsaber at the end of that story and she didn't attend his academy, um, I think sets them off in an interesting direction there. Um, But a lot of the Hand of Thrawn duology, when Mera is lecturing Luke about the things that he's done in the other authors' works, a lot of that is commentary specifically about the Dark Empire comic book series, uh, Jedi Academy, the Black Fleet Crisis. I agree with him rightly pointing out that Luke, in many stories, leans too hard on the Force, and they were using the Force as this giant superpower that can do anything. That's the wrong way to treat the Force, in my opinion. I agree with Zahn about that, but I feel like you can hear the author speaking through Mera, and that starts to set my teeth on edge a little bit. I also feel like the romance in this particular story is rushed. I never completely bought it. Had it been more organic over a longer series and possibly with other authors, I think it would have worked better for me. And honestly, their relationship does work later on in the other series under um, the Del Rey Publishing, but I felt like them falling in love and pledging to marry each other in this series, it all goes too fast for my tastes. And this was ultimately Zahn getting what he wanted. He always wanted Luke and Mara to be together, and I think he probably had a lot of contempt for the other love interests that had been introduced in some of the other novels. Another reason why I didn't quite want to read this series in this part of my reading these books is because it references a lot of other characters that were introduced in other series, including Corin Horn from the X-Wing series. They do make reference to some of his other love interests, such as Gary O'Captison from the Truce of Bakura, or Callista from the Barbara Hambly novels, Booster Terek, also from the X-Wing novels. Um, if you don't know who some of those people are, or even Lando's wife, Tendra Rasant from the Corellian trilogy. If you don't know who these people are, some of these references aren't going to make sense. And so I was a little worried that that might pull some people out of the story. Um, that said, I do think it was an appropriate lead in to where publishing would go under Del Rey. The next big story that got told was the Yuuzhan Vong invasion. And while I'm not a huge fan of the Yuzhang Vong themselves, what I loved about that series is that the stakes in Star Wars were raised to an incredibly high level. Because in the past, you did have events that would change things, introducing new political factions, new rivalries, new groups like Talon Card's smuggling group. But the Yuuzhan Vong crisis led to the first time that a major character was allowed to die, and not just die, but be killed. And if you're not familiar with that story, I won't spoil that part if we ever happen to get there. It's a pretty old spoiler at this point, but it would be shocking if you didn't know, so I'm not going to say it. But besides that, the conflict was raised to such a level that entire planets were destroyed, or irrevocably altered. Um, you had many, many new characters introduced and interweaved with the old characters from the old publishing. It really made the Star Wars publishing program feel alive and organic, and the characters were elevated, some of them to the same level as the movie characters, in the sense that you were so intimately familiar with them by this point that it felt like they'd always been there. So I don't want to knock the Hand of Thrawn duology too much. It just wasn't my favorite from that standpoint. I am curious to hear what you guys thought. I know a lot of you were really looking forward to this series. I know a couple of you were especially interested in the romance between Luke and Mara. I'm kind of curious to see what your take is on that. Um, I think the final thing that I want to go into is I have spent the last couple of weeks thinking real hard about what I wanted to read next. I knew I wanted to have a palate cleanser. I wanted to get away from Timothy Zahn for a little bit, just because I love Zahn's work. This is one of them that I am not so big a fan of, but I like most of his stuff. But I wanted to do something a little bit different, and I was thinking I wanted to do something not quite as long form. I kind of toyed with the idea of doing Shadows of the Empire. I'd still like to do that one, but I know I would do a lousy Darth Vader voice, so I'm kind of holding off on that one for now. I felt also like I would like to either change time frames, eras, and I've also been kind of itching to tell a Sith story. There's not a lot of those, there are a few, but I was really seriously considering whether or not I should do the Darth Bane trilogy. But I changed my mind. I did make a decision tonight, and I got to thinking about it. And when I started reading these stories, it was because of last year at Star Wars Celebration when they showed the trailer for Ahsoka. And the trailer upset me because you had Ahsoka literally uttering the line that Thrawn was heir to the Empire. And I knew they were not going to do a faithful adaptation of that story. And it made me angry that they were trying to drop that to bring viewers in. And so I decided I was just going to read one chapter from the real Heir to the Empire story so that you could see how the quality of the story starts off just in that first chapter. And I didn't imagine that anybody would actually be interested in hearing this, but a few people did. And they reached out and they said, "We like this. Are you going to keep going?" And so I decided, all right, I'll do another chapter or two, and that's probably all that will come of it. But in the process of doing that, more and more people reached out. They were encouraging, and I really enjoyed hearing people's feedback. And I was quite surprised and delighted to find how many people either don't have the time or the ability or the desire to read themselves, but they enjoy hearing a good story. And that became really gratifying to me to hear from people who had not heard these stories before, but were getting introduced to them here. And so I want to take the time to thank all of you for that. This has been really rewarding for me. In my day to day life, outside of the commentary here and all of that, my day job is very stressful. And there are days when you can see it on my face. I hear people mention it in the streams that I'm on. They say that sometimes, like when we've been watching The Acolyte, they say that it's killing me hearing them talk about The Acolyte. Usually, it's not that. It's that I've had a rough day at work, and I'm trying to put myself back together after a hard day. This is one of the ways that I'm able to do that, and your patronage and encouragement, it means the world to me, and I appreciate every one of you that comes here to listen to a story. It makes my day, and I really appreciate that, and I want you all to know that. Getting away from that, what made me decide on this next novel is kind of the same thing that made me start on the first, was that Ahsoka insulted me with how it was treating Heir to the Empire. And so now I've decided we're going to go to the inspiration for The Acolyte. We're going to tell the real story of Darth Plagueis. Now, this is a novel written by James Luceno. He is an excellent Star Wars author. He was a very close friend of Brian Daley, who was responsible for writing the Han Solo trilogy way back in the day. This would have been, I guess, the EU before the EU was really formally recognized as a thing. He also was the guy who wrote the scripts to the National Public Radio Star Wars radio dramas, which are some of my absolute favorite. James was a very close friend of his, and they are both excellent, excellent authors. I do have to confess something about Darth Plagueis, though. This is a novel that I began but never finished. I got, I think, probably three quarters of the way through this novel, I believe this was also right around the time that my son was born and sick, and so I had to put it aside, and I never picked it up again to finish it. So now I'll get to read this novel in full with all of you. Um, I'm not as familiar with it as some of the others, as I said, because I haven't finished it. Some of the voices that I try and do may not be real great as I try and figure out these characters, but I'm going to do my best. I'm not quite sure when I'll start reading it. I might try and begin tomorrow night, depending on what's going on. We'll just have to wait and see what happens. But I hope you're looking forward to it. I am curious to hear what you guys thought of the Hand of Thrawn duology and what you think about the upcoming Darth Plagueis. And I hope we'll all be talking again real soon. See you later.